Welcome back to Mythic Sky Storytime. I'm Dr. Laura Tad, spiritually oriented psychological astrologer, educator, and author. In this episode, I'm going to talk about some of the astrological weather we have going on and the upcoming full moon on June 14th. As is always the case, in late May and early June, we're in the time of Gemini, right? That time of year when the sun is in the sign we associate with the twins of the cosmos. This particular full moon is going to take place on the 14th of June at 7:51 a.m. here on the East Coast and will be at 23 degrees, 25 minutes Sagittarius. And that's exactly 180 degrees away from where the sun will be, because during any full moon, that's how full moons occur, is they are exactly 180 degrees or exactly opposite where the sun is at that time. And while all full moons are particularly powerful in and of themselves, and we could just talk about the full moon, it's important to unpack sort of the various components of the signs involved with the full moon and other things that the moon may be in relationship with at this particular time, because every year around this time we get a full moon in Sagittarius, but it will vary in terms of degree and its relationship to other bodies, other celestial objects in the sky. So before we talk about the full moon itself, it's good to unpack some of the other components involved in this particular full moon. And given that we're in the time of Gemini, I thought I'd talk a little bit about Gemini itself and the story of Gemini and how we have come to understand this sign and some of the myths associated with it. So in general, there's, throughout the world, there's many stories about twins, and lots of different cultures, lots of different mythologies have stories of twins. And that's very true as well when it comes to astrology and in Greek and Roman mythology, which is where we get most of the myths we pull from in Western astrology, or what we refer to as Western astrology. And so the twins that are most closely associated with Gemini are Castor and Pollux, and in part because collectively they are known as the Dioscuri in Greek or Gemini in the Latin, right? So the word itself refers to these twins as their singular unit is the word Gemini, and Castor and Pollux were brothers. Now there's various versions of myths associated with them, and there's different stories that involve them. But in general, part of what's helpful is to look at their origin story, and even amongst that, there are some variations. But in all versions, at least one of them, if not both of them, are the son of Zeus and Leda, who was a human, right? And throughout much of the Greek myth, Zeus is always transforming himself into various creatures or appearing to human women in disguise to seduce them. And in part, he comes in disguise, not so much to seduce them, but to avoid detection from his wife Hera. And so that's part of the story of the origin of Castor and Pollux, is that Zeus transforms himself into a swan to seduce Leda and disguise himself from Hera. And the result of their rendezvous is both Castor and Pollux in several versions of the myth. In other versions, it's solely Pollux who's his son. And part of where there's some differentiation or confusion is that according to the myths, the same night that Leda is with Zeus, she is also with her husband, who is the king of Sparta. And Leda being with both men on the same night results in the birth of multiple children. And so there are different versions of the story as to who is the father of who. But there is Castor and Pollux. There's also their sister Helen, who is also the daughter of Leda and the king of Sparta. She's never considered to be Zeus's daughter, but she is the sister of Castor and Pollux. Helen, of course, is Helen of Troy. And so we get this tether with the story of Castor and Pollux to the face who launched 1,000 ships, as she's referred to by Homer in the Iliad. And so Helen is abducted, which leads to the Trojan War. Castor and Pollux go out to rescue their sister. And one of the things that we can take from looking at this and understanding this connection between Castor and Pollux, who are twin brothers, even if they have different fathers, and their sister, is that we start seeing some of the themes that are associated with Gemini as a sign, because Gemini as a sign governs siblings. So we see that in the twinning of Castor and Pollux, as well as their loyalty to their sister. So siblings showing up in that way as well. Additionally, one of the things that Gemini is often associated with is this idea of seeking and going out and looking for things. And they go out and look for their sister. So we see that show up in this mythology as well. So that is some of the undercurrent of the sign of Gemini, is the importance of siblings, be they biological or chosen, and this idea of seeking, of going out into the world to find something that is lost or is missing, and that sort of constant yearning is part of that energy of Gemini. And I bring this up because in order for us to have a Sagittarius moon, we must have the sun, or the Sagittarius full moon, we must have the sun in Gemini. And so there is a piece of this energy, of this Gemini energy of siblings and seeking, that is part of this full moon, even though the moon itself will be in Sagittarius. Now, in my last show, I talked about Mercury having gone retrograde, or about to go retrograde. And now it's just gone direct. It was retrograde for about 3 weeks. It went direct on the 3rd of June. And even though it is currently direct, that is no longer retrograde, we are still in this period of time known as the shadow of the retrograde. And we'll be in that period of time until the 19th of June, so till a few days after the full moon. And part of what that shadow energy is, although it's rarely as wonky of an energy as the retrograde itself, it can have some undertones of that retrograde energy, of that potentiality for miscommunication, for breakdowns in technology, for breakdowns in communication. And this becomes an added piece to this full moon, not because it's actually particularly an aspect to it, but because Mercury is one of the planets most intensely associated with Gemini, and we're looking at this full moon, which places the sun in Gemini, and because when Mercury went retrograde, it was in Gemini. It will get back there. It's not back there at the moment, but in order for it to get out of the shadow, it has to make up all the degrees that it backtracked through. And having gone retrograde at 4 degrees Gemini, until it is at 5 degrees Gemini, we're not out of that shadow. So we are still seeing this Mercurial Gemini theme as part of what's going on right now, and this focus on communication and what are we communicating, how are we communicating, how are we not communicating, and how are we miscommunicating. And seeking out more information or more answers in that process, or seeking new ways to communicate. And that will still be part of the general themes of the moment for the next week or so, till we are out of the shadow. And it may be part of the larger theme. It's part of this larger theme of this full moon and this focus around communication and the need to make choices, but not necessarily having all of the information because Mercury was retrograde, and so seeking more information, that Gemini energy of seeking and going out to gather more data so that the proper or the most advantageous choice could be made. So that's part of this general theme as we're moving in the direction of this full moon and as Mercury moves out of this current retrograde shadow. And as we get more data, we're able to more accurately weigh our choices and decide what direction to go, right? So as Castor and Pollux were seeking out their sister, they were having to navigate waters, quite literally, and make choices about the best way to go and find her. So we're in some of that energy ourselves right now. And shifting gears a little bit to shift into that energy of Sagittarius. So we have this Gemini energy that's about seeking and siblings, be they blood or chosen, and our connection with them, and having to make some choices maybe around siblings or even just things that you're seeking and having to choose how you go about seeking them, or what is it that you are seeking and is it actually what you want. All right, so in addition to that energy, the full moon itself in Sagittarius gives us this long view. That's part of the difference of Gemini and Sagittarius in their oppositions and being different signs or sort of in response to one another, is that Gemini often takes the short view and Sagittarius has the long view. And while Gemini is about adventure, it's sort of quick trips. They often talk about like the difference in our personal astrology. Gemini is commuting, where Sagittarius is a summer abroad, right? That longer view, that long distance, as opposed to a, weekly, daily drive or traveling. So as we turn to this particular full moon itself, we are seeing additional themes of this duality that shows up in the twin themes of Gemini. Because even though it's not twins, right, we have this balance. There is this yin and yang, receptive, directive energy in the energy of a full moon in and of itself. So regardless of sign, we sort of are dealing with that duality. And in the last full moon that we had, this one's very different because the previous full moon we had in May was a total lunar eclipse. And so it was very powerful, but very different than the current one. And the big picture of the full moon in Sagittarius in some ways may feel like a bit of a relief or a release as compared to when the moon was full in Scorpio during the eclipse, because that was such an amplification of intense emotion and maybe even overpowering or overwhelming emotion. And in contrast, Sagittarius is such an optimistic sign that even if we're feeling big emotions, we may feel more able to navigate them or more capable of holding the enormity of them without going into overwhelm and feeling almost braver to navigate them, as opposed to the overwhelm that the Sagittarian full moon, or the Scorpionic full moon rather, may have brought in. And that bravery can have us more willing to take risks, right? Sag sort of likes taking risks, it's very adventurous. And so there's a willingness to be potentially more emotionally vulnerable than we felt capable of or willing to be during the Scorpio full moon, because there was a gravitas to that this particular full moon, although powerful, doesn't have quite the same gravity to it, or the fear of the gravity of it. The full moon may not have even in May had that sort of real gravity to it, but we may have construed that or conflated that to be that way, even if that was untrue, because Scorpio tends to be such an intense emotional experience. One of the challenges, of course, in this greater optimism that we can have with Sagittarius, or this more carefree energy as opposed to that scorpionic full moon from a month ago is that being braver is great. Being willing to take risks is great. But sometimes we can leap before we look. We can act on or express emotions before we've really processed them, before we're really sure about how we feel. We can sort of lean into it prematurely. And so that can be one of the vulnerabilities under this full moon. And so wanting to make sure that in that optimism, that you temper yourself a little if you can, so that you don't end up declaring emotions that maybe the other person or the person with whom you are divulging your emotions to may not be ready to hear, right? So using that intellectual energy of Gemini to help you assess if it's the appropriate moment to express how you feel. Even though authentic, honest, emotional expression is important, sometimes it's not that you don't say it, but there's a timing, right? And so using some of that Gemini opposition energy of the sun to help you gather enough data to determine when to express your emotion as opposed to not express it, or express it prematurely or in an inopportune time to be received. So if we break down some of this full moon, right? So if we're talking about it, it's on the 14th, and it's going to occur at 23 degrees, 25 minutes of arc. And we unpack this symbolism. And so as I've talked before, there is something called Sabian symbols that unpacks the zodiac, or has attributed to each degree of the zodiac a phrase or an imagery or line to it that invokes sort of the feeling and emotion of every degree of the zodiac. And when working with Sabian symbols, you always look at 1 degree beyond the degree that it's occurring in, because there's minutes and seconds of arc, right? So as soon as you're past 0 minutes, 0 seconds of a degree, you're past that degree to some extent. And from a Sabian symbol perspective, then you'd look at the next degree. So in this case, with the full moon occurring at 23 degrees, 25 minutes, we then look at the Sabian symbol of 24 degrees Sagittarius to understand part of what this full moon may be ushering in. And so here we see the phrase, the bluebird perched on the gate of a little cottage, right? So we get this sort of imagery that comes out of that phrase. And the Sabian symbols were originally channeled by a medium that the late astrologer Mark Edmund Jones worked with in the 1920s. And so this is what came through for them, and they're working together, and they have a different one for every degree of the zodiac. And so unpacking this particular one, there's a number of things going on, right? So we have a bird and the gate and the cottage, and in particular, a bluebird is important. It's not simply a bird. The fact that it's a bluebird can be understood, particularly if we think about how bluebirds were understood 100 years ago, if we're looking at the 1920s being when these were first brought into consciousness. Bluebirds have often been associated with joy and with luck, which are very much Sagittarian words. And so we have this joyous bird, this bird of luck. And in addition to that, birds in and of themselves are often associated with the sign of Gemini, in part because they're very tied to Mercury, with Mercury, the god, having winged sandals, right? And birds in lots of mythologies around the world are thought to be messengers, and Mercury being the messenger of the gods, right? So we get this parallel with the bird to the Gemini opposition, as well as the symbolism of a bluebird being very much a Sagittarian archetype of joy and luck. Right, so we get this lucky, joyful, communicative bird who is the messenger. He's messaging, the message the bluebird brings is that of joy. Right, so we see that as part of this full moon. if we continue to unpack that, then we see that joy, part of why it's associated with Sagittarius is the etymology of joy, right? We get from jovial, which comes from Jove, which is Jupiter, and Jupiter being the ruling planet of Sagittarius, right? So it's very much this tether directly to the Sagittarian archetype at the same time that birds are messengers and very much tied to the sign of Gemini. So it's a really fantastic degree for this particular full moon. And if we unpack this phrase more, right, the latter part of the line, we see this little cottage and the gate of this little cottage. And so if we start to speculate about perhaps what Mark Edmund Jones was getting at here, cottages, particularly again, if we're thinking about a century ago, right, there's a simplicity associated with cottages. There's a sort of earlier, simpler time associated with cottages. And that cottage in the woods, sort of almost Snow White-esque imagery that could show up in our thoughts when we think about sort of a little cottage in the woods. So we see this bluebird and this building, this environment that's associated with a simpler time. And so that may be part of this archetype of this 24 degree, but therefore the 23 and change full moon, of the joys of simplicity, the joys of a simpler time. And that may be part of what we are being asked to connect with during this full moon, is connecting with the joy of simplicity, the joy of slowing down. As fast and as sort of energetic as Sagittarius can be, being that it's a fire sign, there is this sort of magical quality of slowing down to speed up, if that makes sense, and going inward so that you can go forward. And within that simplicity, right, there can be optimism that is a great part of the Sagittarian archetype as well. That you stop and smell the roses by this cottage, right? Cottages, sort of the imagery that pops up, it's a little cottage in the woods surrounded by flower beds, right? So it's sort of stopping to smell the roses in the midst of our optimism, the joy of being present in the moment. And if we are that bluebird of joy on the gate of the cottage, right, the joy of observing that simplicity, not simply necessarily even adding greater simplicity to our lives, but observing the simplicity of joy, that to be truly present and engaged in our life can be joyful. And that may be part of what this full moon is asking of us to pay attention to. And so in working with any full moon, it is a good thing to think about the sign that it's in, as we've been talking about, and then observe in your own life, because full moons are about the moon being at its zenith. It's about completion. What is it that you are completing? What are you letting go of? What do you need to find the next chapter for, or finish up so that the new chapter can begin under the new moon in 2 weeks? So as you start to contemplate that, and that's true with every full moon, then you tailor it to the sign that it's in, right? So with this particular full moon being in Sagittarius, thinking about those things associated with the sign of Sagittarius and what you might let go of or transform or release that is Sagittarian in archetypal nature, right? And so some of the terms we often associate with Sagittarius, in addition to what I've been talking about, right, is adaptability, is very Sagittarian, and sort of that easy flow, willing to change course if and when needed, is a very Sagittarian energy. Additionally, right, Sag being associated with Jupiter, and Jupiter being Zeus in the Greek pantheon, Sag is very much about expansion. And so where are you expanding or not expanding? Or where could you expand, or where do you overexpand? Sag has a lot to do with trust and truth and honesty. How do you engage with those things in your life or not? there's a real part of Sag as being a fire sign that can also be about intuition. All the fire signs can sort of have that intuitive spark energy to them. And being related to that Gemini archetype of seeking, and Sagittarius has that, as I was saying, sort of this longer journey where Gemini's short trips and Sag being long journeys or epic journeys, right? So there can be a restlessness to Sagittarius energy and a wanderlust energy as well, and sort of almost a compulsion to wander, right? And having a hard time in being a fire sign of staying still and feeling like you have to seek, you have to go out on adventure, or you're not fully alive. And so that's part of that Sagittarian archetype. So to work with this particular full moon, right, starting to think about or postulate and form answers to questions that can help you figure out what would be best for you to let go of, or what you're needing to let go of. I've got a couple questions to just sort of start that percolating for you. And some of that can be, when it comes to optimism, looking at optimism from the perspective of where are you optimistic and where have you struggled to be optimistic? And where, because this can be part of the shadow of archetype, is your optimism so great? Is it overblown and therefore unrealistic, right? That can be part of that shadow of that Sagittarian energy, is so optimistic that you're not realistic. Oh, it's all good. It's all going to work out fine, and not actually paying attention to what's in front of you. And so in working with the full moon, writing down where that might be true for you and releasing that, or even in just a more general sense, wanting to release any tendency you might have to be so optimistic that you're not realistic, right? So that can be part of what you can work with during this full moon. And some of it too can be looking at with the idea that Sagittarius can be about trust and truth and honesty. Where are you trusting and where are you not? Who are you trusting and who are you not trusting? And where is that a accurate assessment of the situation or a given situation? And where are you projecting either optimism or pessimism into a situation, right? Maybe somebody's more trusting than you are believing them to be. Or conversely, you may be too quick to trust, right? And you need to get more data. You need more information. With full moons that have so much to do about letting go is, you could write about letting go of your tendency to trust too quickly, right? That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be trusting, but you want to be mindful of when you choose to trust and when you choose to pause, right? That can be a learning arc for all of us. But in working with this full moon, even just, it can be specific situations that you want to let go of any guilt or shame of moments when maybe you've trusted too quickly and it led to repercussions that were not favorable. And conversely, maybe a failure to trust somebody led to things being more complicated or unnecessarily complex because you try to do it all on your own because you're not trusting other people to help, right? So any of those sort of situations you can write down and be part of your release during the full moon. Part of this too during the full moon, right? Because Sagittarius Jupiter is about expansion, you can use this full moon to help when you let go of times where you have shrunk yourself, right? Maybe you've made yourself smaller than you truly are out of a fear of your own greatness, right? Some people fear success more than they fear failure. And it's actually, from what I've seen with clients, a more common phenomena is that people don't act on something or don't go after something, not because they fear failure, but because they fear success. And what happens if they succeed? And then what? And then they have to make new choices. Or maybe it means they have to let go of things or people who are threatened by that success. And so rather than have to deal with the dynamic or the instance where someone is uncomfortable with your success, you shrink, right? That can be part of how people operate sometimes. And so using this full moon as an opportunity to let go of that fear of success, that conscious or unconscious shrinking of your own personal power, so that you don't, it's not even outshine others, that you simply shine because others may be struggling to shine as well. And you fear how people will respond to you shining rather than being supportive of you. You can use this full moon as an opportunity to let go of that fear of your own greatness. And a couple other things, right? So because Sagittarius, Jupiter also governs our belief systems, right? It's not religion in terms of devotion. That's much more Piscean and Neptunian energy, but religion in the sense of theology. And so the actual belief systems or spiritual belief systems that you hold, right? And using this full moon, if there's certain beliefs that you've outgrown or really you no longer find to be congruent with your larger worldview, you can use this full moon as an opportunity to let go of those ideas or ideals that you maybe once held very closely and you now find to be out of step with the direction of your life. And another piece that you could work with during this full moon is that in that optimism that is so Sagittarian, that it is vulnerable to escapist behavior or avoidant behavior, in that so optimistic that you're not realistic, right, is really the shadow of that Sag energy. And so checking in with yourself of where is that showing up and where can you let that go, right? Where can you work to be more present and still be expansive, so that it can be a expanding out in all directions, showing up to be present in an expansive way rather than an escapist way, which can be part of that shadow of Sagittarius. So as you are working to unpack these for yourselves and looking at any terms you might find online, keywords associated with Sagittarius, because this particular full moon is square or 90 degrees away from Neptune in the sky, you may find it really helpful to get clarity about what would be in your best interest to let go of by connecting with that Neptunian energy. And Neptune really governs our unconscious. So working with that Neptunian energy in the square can help mitigate its negative impact, its less desirable impact, right? So not working with Neptune, which as governs our unconscious, can mean that you're making decisions or you're lacking clarity around the decisions that you're making, or the decisions you're making lack clarity. And working with that Neptunian energy by leaning into it, by using meditation or the dream time or any different techniques or exercises or tools you may have that help you connect with the unconscious in a healthy way, using those to help curate the terms or questions or things you want to let go of and release and transform, can really be a helpful way of working with that square. So working with the dream time, even asking the night before the eclipse for some clarity about what you should release during the full moon could be one way of doing it. Meditating before you make a list of things to let go of. And that can be a walking meditation. It doesn't have to be, sitting cross-legged with your hands in a mudra. It can be acquired in a variety of ways, as long as it's the healthy part of the archetype and not avoidant escapist behavior. That will definitely amplify the lack of clarity around what you're letting go. So if you do that in the lead up to the full moon itself, the night before, particularly given that the exact full moon is going to be in the morning, and for many people in the US anyway, you likely won't be awake. The East Coast, it'll be 7 in the morning, but it will be pretty early on the West Coast. That the night before you can do some preparation, or that night ask for a dream to help you get clarity, and then in the morning, right, because really sort of 8 hours on either side of a full moon, you can really work with that energy most powerfully. So in that lead-in, night before, get some clarity. In the morning, write your list of what you want to let go of and release to the cosmos, and then burn that list. And if you live in an apartment building, I had to struggle with this when I lived in apartments, and didn't have a balcony where I could do any ritual work that involved flame. You can come up with different strategies, right? You could just, sometimes if it's small, you can burn it in the sink. If you're afraid of setting off a fire alarm, you can also, you can use water. You could tear something up and have it dissolve and have it go down the drain is another way that you could release things if it's not possible to burn it. Ideally, you would burn a list, particularly with the full moon being in a fire sign. But I know that's not possible for everybody. But you make your lists or your notes and journaling about what you want to let go and release, and then burn that and have it let it go into the cosmos, and working with the full moon in that way. And that can help transform it, help that transmutation that can happen as it changes form, right? And becomes smoke or is dissolved and washes away. Now, the full moon is powerful for all of us, right? It's globally, we'll all be experiencing it, but it can be any given full moon. Part of what's important in looking at the sign is to see how that falls in your own chart, right? So the area of your chart, if you know it well enough to know where 23 degrees falls into your chart, that can give you some added information. Additionally, for those of you who have the sun or moon, any personal planets, so Mercury, Venus, Mars, and any of the angles, right? So the ascendant, descendant, midheaven, or iliac coloclea, or nadir, in any of the mutable signs, this will be a more powerful full moon for you because it will be an aspect to that, or to some degree, right? Some degree of orb, or degrees away from those parts of your chart. So again, sun, moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, ascendant, descendant, midheaven, and nadir, or IC, which is iliac coloclea in Latin. And the mutable signs are Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces, right? We get that Gemini Sag as the mutable signs that are the sun and moon, and the other two being Virgo and Pisces. And so for those of you with things in relationship to those signs, it's likely to be a more powerful full moon. If you don't have anything there, it doesn't mean there isn't benefit for you to do the moon work or that it won't have some impact on you. It's just likely to be a little less impactful or a less intense emotional experience, even though there's still benefit to work with the moon, regardless of how it aspects your chart. So I hope all of you have a lovely full moon and are enjoying that the Mercury retrograde is quieting. We're out of the actual retrograde, and hopefully the shadow will be a little less wonky and fewer shenanigans as we move through the last 10 days of this shadow. And thank you for listening. Once again, I am Dr. Laura Tad. This has been Mythic Sky Storytime. As always, please like and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. For questions or more information about how I work, please go to my website, mythicsky.com.